Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fair redistricting workshop this afternoon. It's a beautiful day in New Hampshire, so we appreciate everyone being inside. My name is Olivia Zink, and I'm the Executive Director of Open Democracy, and I live in Franklin, New Hampshire. And we're a nonpartisan nonprofit organization that works on structural democracy, but we're really excited to have some of our partner organizations, the League of Women Voters New Hampshire, Granite State Progress, 603 Forward, and Kent Street, joining us in what we call our New Hampshire Fair, Live Free and Map Fair project, where we've held several Map-a-Thons. We've also had town meeting leaders in 74 communities pass petition warrant articles or resolutions at their local councils to call for a fair redistricting process. So I want to thank our mappers, those participating in the Map-a-Thon, those who have participated in a town meeting warrant article, our technical team, as well as our coalition partners, as well as the legislator and press who are here today. We have brought you some experts that know technically how redistricting works, and I'd like to introduce our first guest, a national expert on redistricting policy. Some of you have met in Concord, Yurij from the Brennan Center, who will talk about the best practices for explaining the legislative fair process and some of the constitutional requirements that makes New Hampshire unique. So please welcome Yurij.
Thank you very much, and I hope my screen is shared, and it's the right screen. I can't quite seem to figure that out 18 months in. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Special hello to Representative Marjorie Smith, who worked very hard over the years to get an independent commission for New Hampshire. That effort did not work out as many had hoped, but here we are on the threshold of this upcoming redistricting cycle, and we will talk about what laws do apply and how to make do with the current processes and systems that are in place. So the first thing, and I just want to start out as a level setter at really a 101 level. We want to talk about why redistricting happens, what New Hampshire looks like by the numbers, and what the timing is. So we have a regular redistricting cycle because there's a requirement that all districts have roughly the same number of people. And that is tacked to the decennial census, which was conducted in 2020. And the numbers are about to be released in the next couple of weeks or so. That is what gives us the population data we need to know that the population has changed. And while New Hampshire hasn't grown tremendously quickly over the course of the last decade, adding about 60,000 people between 2010 and 2020, the population change has not been even across the state, with some parts of the state that you see in red actually losing population, and other parts shaded in green, and the deeper green, the more population gains there have been, gaining population. So because of these population changes, district boundaries have to be adjusted at least every decade. The goal for redistricting shouldn't just be to comply with this purely numerical, mathematical equality principle. We should also group people together in ways that make sense for representation. That is the whole idea with democracy, and the principle really is for legislatures to be an accurate reflection of the population. And so it's not just how many people are there, it's also how do people live? Where do they live? How do they work? And how have those things changed over the course of the decade? And this includes the needs that different people have, and also the presence of, say, new industries and those sorts of things. In terms of timing, as I mentioned, the census data will first become available by August 16th, but it will be made available in a disaggregated format that the public won't be able to use, and actually that the general court, the legislature, won't be able to use either without some statistical sorting, so to speak. The way that I think about it is the Census Bureau will provide the cookie dough, but the cookies have to be rolled before they can they take their shape, and that's so all the information will be there, but it has to be put in the right geographic buckets in order to be useful. The official publication of census data isn't until later in September. The Census Bureau has given us this September 30th day. The good news for New Hampshire is the various deadlines are still a ways off, and there's plenty of time to conduct a full and open and transparent redistricting process. The first deadline, and of course deadlines are tacked to relevant elections, and new districts need to be in place ahead of 2022 elections. But the candidate filing deadline isn't until June 2022, and the primary election date is relatively late, giving the state plenty of time to set new districts. So that's the nuts and bolts of redistricting. And now let's transition into what are the various laws, both federal and state, that apply when this process plays out in the next couple of months. So first, starting with federal law, there aren't too many requirements. First, as I mentioned, districts have to be of roughly equal population, and that is an interpretation of the Constitution, and it applies to districts at all levels of government. It's as true for the Executive Council as it is for the U.S. House of Representatives seats, State House, State Senate, county councils, across the board. There are some differences. For U.S. House seats, the population equality has to be pretty exact. And really, the gold standard is no more than one person difference. And the goal is to get precision in terms of equality. With state districts, there's a little bit more leeway. Generally speaking, the population of state districts, so say state Senate districts, can deviate by up to 10%. And what that means is there can be a 10% population difference between the most populated district and the least populated district. Another constitutional requirement is that race cannot be a predominant factor when districts are drawn. This is less of an issue for New Hampshire, so I won't spend much time on it, but it does factor in the South and other places where there are sizable communities of color. In terms of statutory requirements, there aren't so many here either. There's a requirement that congressional districts be single member as opposed to multi-member, and the state must comply with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is still operative, but not especially relevant for redistricting in New Hampshire. The state requirements is where things get a little tricky. Across the board, districts are required to be contiguous, and the population should be as equal as possible. But for the Executive Council, there are no criteria for how districts are drawn. And so really it is a blank slate. For the state Senate districts, there's an obligation to maintain the boundaries of towns, wards, and unincorporated places to the extent possible. And for the state house, towns and wards with sufficient population for one or more seats should constitute whole districts, and this is both single member or multi-member. Those with insufficient population can be combined to form other single or multi-member districts. And excess populations can be combined to form at-large or floterial districts. And the operative thing with state house seats is that town and ward boundaries really have to be preserved whole. This last requirement about forming floterial districts and the ability to draw multi-member districts in New Hampshire is an area that can be subject to manipulation, political manipulation, and abuse. I'd be happy to get more into it, but essentially, say a town that can support 5 districts and is 60% Republican and 40% Democratic, draws a multi-member district, there is a possibility that all 5 of those representatives are Republican, even though that town, if you're looking at it purely from a mathematical standpoint, should be sending 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats to Concord. The interesting thing about multi-member districts in New Hampshire law is there is a process for towns that are drawn to be multi-member districts to split themselves into single-member districts. And there is a commission-based process that conducts hearings, receives input, and makes recommendations ultimately, and ultimately it's something that the voters would have to approve. But these 2 mechanisms that are built into New Hampshire's constitution, the floterial districts and the multi-member districts, are things to really be aware of and watch out for as districting heats up. So those are the requirements. What are the best practices? Again, these aren't exactly the criteria that we would urge when we work on policy reform, and certainly it wasn't what we were pushing for when we were working with Representative Smith and others on changing the process. And so from our standpoint, the best practices for map drawing criteria is first and foremost to comply with federal law, and really there's not much option there. Second is for districts to be drawn on a total population basis, and to be very, very clear about that. In New Hampshire, thankfully, that's already written into the Constitution. For the most part, though, there is a quirk that allows the legislature to exclude certain non-permanent residents from the totals of the population. Third, districts should be geographically contiguous, and that means that a district should be drawn using one continuous boundary. There shouldn't be an island that doesn't connect to the rest of the district that is still represented by the same representative. Fourth, and this is probably most important, is districts shall respect communities of interest and, where relevant, and in a state like New Hampshire it is relevant, political subdivisions like towns or wards. And then finally, districts shall be compact. And I want to go back to that 4th point about communities of interest. What a community of interest is, and this goes back to why we redistrict in the first place. It's not just to create districts of equal sizes, even though that's what the legal requirement says. It's also to group people together in a way that they can secure effective representation for themselves and their communities. Orienting a redistricting process around communities of interest is about that exactly. Communities of interest is about identifying the glue that holds certain communities together, that creates shared representational needs. And it comes into play in New Hampshire, say when the question arises of what towns should be combined to form a single district, or how do you draw the state Senate districts, which are significantly larger in population than the districts for state house? And the answer should be, well, we want to group people in a way and say it could be communities in the south of New Hampshire that commute into Boston. And that could be a shared identity for certain folks. It could be around something like sharing the same water source, and there could be two towns that share a water source or have an interest in preserving a watershed or something environmental. It could be something like the presence of a particular industry in one part of the state or in particular towns, but not others. The idea here is you're not articulating something that is explicitly partisan. The idea is you're putting the people first, their political needs first, and you're drawing districts in a way that allows them to organize, to have town halls, and ultimately to secure the representation that allows those issues to be raised in Concord and in DC. We also advocate for a couple of prohibitions. These are backstops. These are safeguards to make sure that the redistricting process doesn't go off the rails. And that includes protections for communities of color and a prohibition against partisan gerrymandering. In terms of process, there are a number of best practices that map drawers, and this could be lawmakers, this could be a commission, they should take into account. So first and foremost, it's all about communicating with the public, making sure that the public can meaningfully follow what's happening and participate in what's happening. So that means setting clear timelines. When will redistricting happen? Is there a public comment period? How will it play out over the course of the coming weeks? People are busy and they need to know these sorts of things so they can plan and organize with their neighbors and with their communities to make their voices heard. The second thing is to publish data, make the geographic building blocks clear, and provide for a public information portal. And these are more technical things that are really the bread and butter of redistricting. And this will ensure that people can follow along, that when a map is produced, they can see what the implications are. And so for folks that are doing community mapping and making submissions, either identifying communities of interest or drawing full-on districts, they can do that using the same methods that the legislature intends to use. Third, setting criteria and goals. Ideally, they would be the criteria that you just saw on the previous slide. But even if that isn't the case, an articulation of what the legislature intends to do, what the committee that's in charge of redistricting intends to do is incredibly useful. Fourth, public hearings are indispensable and should occur in two rounds. One, prior to the maps being drawn, to identify things like communities of interest. And then second, once an initial map is drawn, to get feedback on how that map would serve the needs of the population. The goal here should be maximum accessibility and notice. This means making these things digitally accessible, particularly in this tail end of the pandemic, and making sure that it occurs at times that working folks can attend, or people who have obligations, say, during the day. So scheduling some meetings during evenings or on the weekends is a very, very good idea. Finally, it's a great idea to actually incorporate or respond to public comment and to publish a report that explains the decisions that are made. Now, these tips, is assuming that there will be public hearings and public comment periods. And these apply as much to lawmakers as they do to the public that are looking to participate. If you're orienting around communities of interest, the important thing is to define the community, where they live, and articulate that glue. What is it that holds this community together? And not just in a general sense, but specifically, why should this community be kept whole for purposes of having a voice in the legislature or in Congress? What are some of the places and features that are important to this community? These could be things like churches and other sort of civic places like schools. This could be things like the presence of an employer or a particular highway or road that members of the community use, or an environmental feature like a watershed or a forest, things of that nature. Third, what are the issues of common concern? Why, again, are these people being grouped together, and what are the resource needs? And the way that you can think about this is think about what would be raised if you held a community meeting in that place. What would be discussed? What would be raised by the residents of that community? And then finally, you want to think about the existing map and whether the way the map was drawn this past decade made it harder for those things to happen. And with that, I will open up and take questions, and I will stop sharing my screen.
I think Representative Weber had a question in the chat. If you want to unmute Representative Weber.
It actually wasn't a question, it was a comment, which was that it's fine to talk about getting rid of the huge multi-member districts, which do indeed tend to give a small majority of people a large majority of the seats. I just wanted to point out that we have any number of places in the state where they are broken down into single member districts, as in the city of Keene, where there are 5 single member districts, and the Democrats scoop that every single time. And there are certainly Republicans who live in Keene who feel underrepresented. In that case, it's more that Cheshire County and Belknap County kind of cancel each other out, I think. But I just wanted to point that out. It doesn't always work.
Yeah,
none of this works the way it's supposed to often.
I think that is a good point, and certainly it is possible to. I think the example that you raise, and I'm not familiar with the geography exactly, but that could be more of just an instance of straight up gerrymandering, which of course is always a concern as well, depending on how the boundaries of a particular geography are shaped and whether it is done to deprive voters of certain persuasion and inadequate voice.
Other questions, you can raise a hand or put it in the chat. Go ahead and unmute, Mr. Smith.
Thank you. 2 questions. One is, especially for Yuri, as the maps are provided in New Hampshire, will the public have the raw data and the software analytical tools to be able to simulate different mapping and the impact of that mapping? That's really my main question. Oh, the other question is, you brought up about total population, and there's a sensitive issue in New Hampshire, obviously, about permanent residents in college communities, of which there are several important ones in New Hampshire. Is that likely to be a contentious issue?
So I will defer to Olivia and Brian on the latest in terms of the data accessibility in New Hampshire specifically. What I can say is there are a variety of public tools that are now available that will make it easier, regardless of what happens, and regardless of how transparent the legislature will be, to follow along. And that is one of the things about this cycle that is different than in years past. And so as proposed maps are released, it will be possible to overlay that in these open source, publicly available tools to hopefully understand the implications for the redistricting scheme.
Yeah, Mr. Smith, this is Brian Beal. I'm Open Democracy's Deputy Director. We have a project that we're going to tell you about in a couple minutes that is doing exactly what you described. And yes, we do have access to the same data that the state will have. And we're already underway in learning software and how to do this, and learning all what we need to do about the Constitution. And we're going to share some of that with you a little later.
Thank you.
Representative Marjorie Smith.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Excuse me. There is the start of a website on the state site. It's been very slow going. As you know, we don't have great resources to move things along into the 21st century. And there's a little struggle going on, but all of that information will in fact be on the website. And so that's the first thing I want to say. The second is it is at the moment the intention of the chair of the redistricting committee. I was going to say independent, but it's not. The special redistricting committee, Barbara Griffin, announced very specifically today before the Ballot Law Commission that yes, there will be hearings held, and yes, she would like the hearings to be held starting early in the process to make it possible to hear from the public. All of that information will be on the website, as well as information that can be contributed by members of the public who will contribute maps and contribute analysis of maps. So it's not going to be very sophisticated, but it is moving along.
Great. I posted the link to the website for the Special Committee on Redistricting into the chat. And anyone who goes to that website, just click on the headlines of each of those things and you can get the data within that website. There's a question in the chat, Yuri, from Paul. Can you talk about remedies that are available for voters?
Well, this is one of the unfortunate realities, is that we have fewer remedies this time around than we did last time, and we weren't exactly operating from a position of strength in 2011. And that just means that it's more important than ever to be engaged as redistricting is unfolding, to be in touch with the committee that's going to be drawing the districts, because the federal courts have essentially taken themselves out of policing gerrymandering outside of enforcing the Voting Rights Act, which is unlikely to be applicable in New Hampshire. And that really leaves the New Hampshire Supreme Court as the only place to seek recourse. And when you look at the prior litigation from years past, that hasn't always been the most favorable place. The court tends to be fairly deferential to what the legislature has done.
And Yuri's email is available. We'll put it in the chat. So if questions come up later, And also, I know we have the press on the call. If press members would like to schedule a call with Yurij for additional questions, he is available. I'm going to next introduce David Andrews, who's a member of the Open Democracy Action Board. He's an engineer, graduate of the UNH, and is a staff member for Redistricting Data Hub. David?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to get into a little bit about the redistricting tools right now. So there's a number of different redistricting tools that are free that you can use online. There's also a number of desktop apps that you can purchase. So some of those free tools, there's Dave's Redistricting app, there's Districtor, there's District Builder and Representable, and then there's a couple other ones. And then there's Map-a-Thon for ones that you can get on a desktop app, but the desktop app ones are paid versions, and they're rather expensive. So we at Open Democracy and our mapping team are going to be using one of the free ones, and we decided on Dave's Redistricting app. Now, we decided on this specific tool because of its usability, flexibility, and functionality. So this is the main page. It's just davesredistricting.org. They have all the states. So we're going to jump into New Hampshire. It gives you a little bit of so it gives you the current maps, and then it also gives you a little bit of information if you want to see what would be the most competitive districts, what would be the most proportional, which is ridiculous. So you can see that for the Senate, for all the different legislator bodies. So what we're going to do is jump into create a new map just to show you guys what this is capable of doing. I have a number of different maps here, and it stores each one by name, so I can jump back into them if I want to. But we're just going to go up to the top here, create a new map, and we'll just say New Hampshire Executive Council 2010. So the good thing about this particular tool is that it's very flexible. So for instance, it has Congress and the state Senate and the state House, but there's also another options for other. So because our executive council is 5 districts, we're going to plug that in. They're going to have equal population. And then we're able to down here pick and choose what actual data that we want to incorporate. So Dave's Redistricting app uses VEST data, which is the voting and election science team, and that's based out of the University of Florida and Wichita State. And what they do is they take election data for all the different elections, and then they combine that with shape files, so like the actual boundaries of towns and cities and wards. And so they'll pair the election data with the shapefiles, and thus we can use those to do our mapping. So what we're going to do is we're going to plug in 2010 just so that we can get an idea of the population. There's a bunch of different options that you can choose. Let's go with the 2016 Senate because, you know, it was only decided by 1,000 votes, and that's kind of fun. And then we'll click apply, and then this will bring up a map for us, and I'll run you through it just a little bit. So you can see the different districts up here, and it'll change the deviations when we start drawing on the actual map. And so you can tell whether a district has too many people in it, too little people in it, and this will give us an idea of that. If you look at the top here, there's a panning button, so you can go back and forth. You can add landmarks if you want. So if you wanted to add hospitals or schools or anything like that, you can add them in via this tool here. This is the actual paintbrush, and you can change the size of it. So you can start drawing a map up here. And so that'll be our first executive council map. It's going to need to be a lot bigger than that because there's not a lot of people living up there. but you can actually change. You can actually change the size to be county. So you can see that we can add in all 4 counties, and we still don't have enough people for this first district for the executive council. And then there's also an erase tool, and you can choose whether it's precinct or county. So you can erase entire counties if you want to. So then, on the right side, you can see this gives you the population and a lot of other information. So you can hover over a state or a town. So Hanover, and you can see the total population. It'll give you a breakdown by demographics. It'll give you a voting age population breakdown, and then it'll also give you the actual election results for the 2016 Senate. I like to look at Pembroke because Maggie Hassan only won by 2 votes in Pembroke, so that's kind of fun to see. And then, again, going over to the left, you can see that there's a number of different options that you can use. For instance, you can see the entire partisan lean if you want to, and this is based on that 2016 Senate race. But we can bring the colors back. You can see the partisan lean of the districts. So this first district is a little lean Democrat. And then you can also see demographics if you want. Not super helpful in New Hampshire, where we don't have a lot of minorities, but useful nonetheless. You can also add in county lines if you want to. So you can add in county lines, you can add in city lines, which is mostly the old town centers and stuff. The other good thing about Dave's redistricting app is that you can add custom overlays. So what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to grab an SAU map, and then we'll be able to turn this into a shapefile and then put it into Dave's redistricting app. So we'll be able to do that for SAU maps. We can put in maps that have the highways. We can put in maps that have the regional high schools or the regional planning commissions, or really anything that we define as a community of interest, we can put in as an overlay so that we'll be able to look at that while we're doing our mapping, and then use that to draw maps. So let's just draw a little bit real quick, just so we can get an idea of what it looks like. So I'm just going to draw a couple quick maps real quick. So you can see it's pretty easy to use. This is a pretty terrible map because the populations are not equal, but it'll serve for what I want to show. So you can go into here and you can actually see the breakdowns of the populations. So you can see the partisan balances here. It's actually reasonable in terms of partisan balance. We got a Democrat seat, a Republican seat, and 3 swing seats there. So it's actually not too bad. You can see demographic breakdowns, and then it also allows you to analyze the map. So you can see that proportionality is not great because we have the population numbers are way off. I crossed a bunch of county lines, so the splitting isn't really good, but the compactness score is pretty good, and then it's actually pretty competitive. So it'll give you a little bit of an idea of how your map is kind of looking overall. And then you can also go into and you can put in 2 maps. So you can put in 2 maps, compare them, and then it'll give you kind of a quick shot at how the maps are looking overall. But I think we're going to jump to Brian to talk about the Map-a-Thon project.
So what David, thank you, David. David was talking about his tech team. That is part of a larger effort we're calling the Map-a-Thon, which is a citizen-driven map drawing project. So we have over 150 people involved statewide with the Map-a-Thon. And of that, we have about, I think there's 14 on our tech team. The Map-a-Thon, the majority of the Map-a-Thon volunteers are driving our effort to collect information on communities of interest, which Yuri described and which David did a little bit of a description as well. The community of interest, we chose to collect this information through a form. This is a Google form that is that's shareable, and it's being sent by our volunteers all over the state. And we're trying to collect information from 60 questions. There will be an abbreviated version as we get to the end here, as we try and get as many in as possible. And it takes a little over an hour to fill this out. And what it's asking are questions very similar to what Yuri was describing. What connects towns to one another? Large employers, a shared housing issues, but certain problems like the PFAS issue that we're dealing with, opioid addiction, but also things like a shared tourist economy or a paper mill. And so we're collecting information and almost to the person. Every volunteer who's worked on this project has learned something about their community that they didn't know, about their school system, about the connection to hospitals and healthcare, all kinds of different questions on here. And we ask at the very end, if you were to be connected to another town, what would that town be? So we've asked some open-ended questions as well. So they've collected information on this form. We will be sharing this with the Special Committee on Redistricting as our information is completed. We expect to have that done by the end of the month. And then that data will be prepared and imported into our map. So we're going to be able to see our top priorities for the redistricting criteria, or excuse me, not redistricting criteria, the communities of interest criteria. And David's going to do an example of that in a couple minutes. But I'm going to give you a couple of real life examples of where this matters. So I lived in Antrim for about 35 years. Which is in the northeast corner of the Monadnock region. And Antrim is in Hillsborough District 1. Hillsborough District 1 includes Antrim, Hillsborough, and Windsor, a tiny little town of Windsor. But Antrim shares a major employer with Bennington. They share a water aquifer with Bennington, and they have them linked. They have their wells linked together. They share a highway, a major state highway. They're in the same cooperative school district, which Hillsborough and Windsor are not. But they're separated for representation. Bennington is in Hillsborough 3. So this is an example of how towns that are connected in many important cultural ways aren't necessarily grouped together, and they're not being represented that way. David told me about Campton, which Campton is the only town in its county that is in CD1. So it doesn't have any other schools from its school district with it. So, this would be an example of where this got modified during the mapping process in 2011, but it didn't really make a whole lot of sense for the people who live there. It may have been expedient for making the numbers come out right, but it doesn't make a lot of sense for the representation of the folks in Campton. So David is going to share some information about the Executive Council and also about the constraints that Yuri talked about in the New Hampshire Constitution and demonstrate that for you. David?
Hey. Yeah, so we're just going to go over a couple quick examples of the Executive Council map, just to show you a little bit of what we did in our for our mapping team so far. Let me jump in there. Okay, so here's the current Executive Council map, and you can see that this actually is one of the rare examples where it actually shows gerrymandering. Now, gerrymandering can occur without the weird shapes, so it's very important that you look at the statistics behind the maps. So you can see here that they have wide variety of districts with the Executive Council map. So for our mapping team, our initial project for them was to actually draw the Executive Council map. So we came up with a couple of different ones. This was John Crosses, who I think is here, and he had the idea to just stick with county lines. So what he did was he kept all these counties are in District 1 for the Executive Council, and then he tried to keep as many counties together as possible. He wasn't able to fully do it just because of the population of Hillsborough is 400, so it's more than the Executive Council, and I think Rockingham is as well. So he needed to break up a couple of them. But if you look through it, you can see that this is actually a pretty fair map. It's got a little bit of a lean Republican district, but overall it looks a little bit better than our current Executive Council map. I made one here that I tried to go for what regions of New Hampshire are there, and then I tried to kind of work out from there. So I thought North Country, so I drew a map, and this actually got to include the Lakes region as well. And then I thought, well, Western New Hampshire is kind of a one community, Southern New Hampshire, Central New Hampshire, and then the Seacoast as another. And then I kind of built it out from there. And you can see that these are actually super close in population. And if you look at the districts, there's one lean Democrat, one lean Republican, and then three kind of toss-up districts. So this is actually a pretty fair map. But going through, I didn't do anything with communities of interest or anything like that. So there might be some instances where towns are kind of split where they probably shouldn't be. I know Bow and Dunbarton have a pretty close relationship, so maybe that's not the greatest place to split in the world. So there's definitely problems with this map that hopefully we'll be able to remedy once we look at communities of interest when we're doing our mapping. But the way that we get to different maps is by looking at criteria. So we're just going to look at the different criteria that we're going to be using. Let me see. Okay, so this is the constitutional amendment for the United States. So we're going to go into the congressional districts criteria first. So this is just the what the Constitution requires, which is, I think, what everyone knows about. So this is our Map-a-Thon criteria. And so we have the population, which is based on the US constitutional rule. And then these are kind of previous historic criteria. So you saw the two congressional districts earlier, and they follow these rules. So they preserve towns and wards, which is good. They're contiguous, and they preserve cities. So they're not chopping Manchester or chopping Nashua in half anywhere. And then we have our additional Map-a-Thon criteria that we're going to be using when we map our U.S. House district seats. So we're going to try to preserve communities of interest as much as possible, and then we're going to try to conserve county boundaries, and then we're going to try to keep the cores of the prior district in place, because the cores of the constitutional districts are actually pretty good. They have a good combination of rural versus urban, and they're actually pretty both pretty competitive. So if we can preserve the cores of these districts, that's good. So what we'll probably do is start with the current district and then make a few touches, like the example of Campton. So when we talk about the communities of interest in the criteria, this is kind of what we're talking about. We went through and asked everyone to rank their communities of interest, and then this is what we came up with. So we have school districts and shared emergency services, shared water systems, issues, hospitals. So what we'll do is we'll be creating maps and overlays for Dave's redistricting that we can throw in, and that will show all of these different communities of interest, so that when we are doing our mapping, we'll be able to reference those and then come out with maps based on these communities of interest. Next is Senate. Senate has a couple different rules. Population needs to be contiguous. And so, oh, this was the Executive Council, sorry. So for the Executive Council, we have population, the same four pretty much apply for almost all of them. Well, at least the first three. And then we're going to try to preserve communities of interest, preserve counties, and then compactness. So kind of like what my previous map showed, very compact map and not kind of sprawling districts. So then we get to the Senate, and these are actually written into the New Hampshire Constitution, and then we have some other ones for ourselves. Preservation of cities is important, preservations of communities of interest, and then compactness again. Like for the preservation of cities, for instance, in 2010, Manchester actually would have been able to be split into 2 Senate seats almost perfectly. But instead of that, it's kind of split into 3 different districts, and Manchester is just like torn apart. So we're going to try to keep cities together as much as possible when we do our New Hampshire Senate mapping. And then the House, which is the most one, if you're into that kind of thing, there's a lot of different rules for the House. And so here are all the different criteria for the House: population, preservation of towns, contiguity, and then the preservation of counties is written into by state statute. So each county, once the populations are given by the census, will be assigned a certain amount of representatives, and then within that county, we'll be able to map the districts. Another thing that's important is each town needs to have one. It needs to be in one non-flotarial district, and then dedicated districts for eligible towns. So if a town, the 2020 House population will be 3,433. So if a town has that many people or more, it should have its own district with its own representatives. So I'm just going to jump out of here real quick. And then I'm going to kind of jump into the flotarial information a little bit. For those of you that don't know, flotarials are kind of a catch-all for extra population in towns. So because we have so many reps, we need flotarials to be kind of like a fudge factor. So if a town has 4,000 people, 3,300 of that will be assigned to one rep, but then there's an extra 700 people, and thus we need to have another way of having them be represented. Now, the way that the floterials are calculated is extremely complicated. You would think that, say there's a town with 4,000 people and then a town with 5,000 people. If each rep was like 3,000 people, you'd have one person assigned to one town, another to the other, and then you would have one for a floterial seat. But with the New Hampshire Supreme Senate ruling in 2002, it stated that you can't use certain methodologies in order to calculate the floterial seats. So I'm going to bring that up real quick.
You meant Supreme Court, David, right?
Yes, that's exactly what I meant. So the aggregate method is kind of what I just said. You just take the total population divided by the number of representatives, and then that would be, if that falls within the deviation, then it would be okay. But the New Hampshire Supreme Court ruled that this method was not the ideal method in order to calculate floterials. So what the New Hampshire House used in 2010 is the component method here. So it's a little bit more complicated, and what it does is it takes into account the different sizes of populations that are being put into a floterial district. So for that example, for 4,000 and 5,000, 1,000 from one town and 2,000 from the other town. So one town is being represented two-thirds of the seat. So the New Hampshire Supreme Court said that that would violate the one person, one vote law. So in order to calculate this, it's pretty complicated. But for instance, I devised a tool in order to do it. So just to give you a little bit better kind of understanding of it. So if we have a town with 4,500 people and then a town with 5,500 people in it, you can see that this is the aggregate method up here. So because the ideal population for 3 seats is close to 10,000, it's within the aggregate method of deviation, but it is not within the component method of deviation. So that's the problem that we face here in New Hampshire. For instance, if we just took 250 from each, then we would fall within that deviation, and we could have 2 separate districts and 1 floterial between the 2. There's a couple other methodologies that we're looking into in order to kind of give us a little bit more flexibility, but overall, the component method was put forth by the New Hampshire Supreme Court and accepted in 2010. So this is kind of the standard, and this is, I believe, what the tool that the New Hampshire House is going to be using. I believe that it uses the component method, although I haven't actually seen the software. But I think now that we went into all the math of it, I think that's it for me. If anyone has any questions.
So David, would you explain why some towns mathematically can't get their own districts? So we had 62 towns that were eligible for their own House districts in 2011. Out of 152 that were totally eligible, 62 did not get their own House districts. So there are some, from what I understand, there are some that have been able to that you've been able to get to restore that, but there are some that we can't. Why is that?
There's a couple different reasons. So the first reason is it could violate the each town needs to be in one non-floterial district. So in Chichester, where I'm from, Chichester is surrounded by Pembroke, Epsom, Pittsfield, and Loudoun. All of those towns are larger than the 3,300 people. And so Chichester cannot be combined with any other town in order to get up to the population of requiring one representative. So that's one way. And then there's another way is that the deviations of using the component method would not work out. And then there's a third way where they just weren't assigned a seat. So for instance, in with I forget which district it is, but it's with Allenstown, Epsom, and Pittsfield. Each of those towns is large enough in order to have its own district, but Epsom and Pittsfield were kept together instead of giving Pittsfield and Epsom their own representatives.
And Daryl Perry just pointed out that Hudson and Pelham are grouped together, even though they are, I think Pelham is 12,800 and Hudson is 24,000 and something. So they're way over the threshold to have their own districts, but yet they're together. Explanation?
Yeah. So if you just use a simple, if you look at the two towns and use a simple component method, you wouldn't be able to actually split them, but there is ways in order to allow them to be split. So for instance, you could have assigned, so like, for instance, you couldn't have Pelham have 3 reps, Hudson have 7, and then them split 1. But you might be able to have them, I haven't done the exact math on it, but you might be able to have them say Pelham have 2 and Hudson have 6, and then they split 3 flotarials or something like that. You could also combine, Pelham is actually perfectly, not perfectly, but it could be divided into 4 reps, and then Hudson could be combined with another town. So there's a number of different ways in order that you could actually give Pelham and Hudson their own reps. The math is very complicated, though.
Yeah.
Question from Representative Lucy Weber.
Thank you. The other thing that it stands in the way, quite literally, is when you have, as my district, I mean, my district actually got larger as a result of the last redistricting. And we have 3 towns in the district, each entitled to their own representative. But in the middle, there is Westmoreland, which is too small to have its own representative, but it must be in a non-flotarial district of some kind. So in order to get it into a non-flotarial district, the only way, given that we're in the corner of the county on 2 ends and at the corner of the state on one side, the only way to get it done was to make a bigger district and give it more representatives. And that leads to the issue, theoretically, it's possible that we could elect 4 representatives from Westmoreland, which is the smallest town in the district, and none from anywhere else. It's not very likely, but you know, those kinds of things come up when you start looking at the districts you've created. So I just wanted to mention that one as another thing that makes it difficult to make sure that each of those that are entitled to their own district have one.
Yeah, and there's, in 2010, there was actually 10 towns that kind of met that same criteria. Chichester, not Newmarket, Newington, a number of other ones that I can't think of off the top of my head, but there was 10 altogether that were just mathematically, you couldn't do them based on each town having their own non-flotarial district.
Thank you, David. So that, are there any other questions from the audience with a preference toward legislators, if we could? And then we will address some questions at the end. After we dismiss you, we're happy to answer questions from the press as well. Any further questions? All right. So I don't see any further questions. Oh, wait, I have one from Representative Till. Is the non-floaterial requirement in the Constitution?
Yes, it is. And it's in the same spot as each town that has a sufficient population shall have their own representative. So it kind of lays it out. Each town should be in a non-floaterial district, and then, if possible, towns with sufficient population shall have their own representative.
Representative Weber?
Representative Weber, you have another question?
Yeah, and I sort of hesitated as to whether I was even going to pose this or not, but because it has to do with the calculations of the deviations on the floaterial district, and that's getting way into the weeds. But it just occurred to me when I was listening that the computation requirement that you're relying on comes from 2002, and that was prior to the amendment of the New Hampshire Constitution to specifically provide for floaterial districts. And I know that that may have been the method that was chosen to be used the last time, but I'm not sure. My question is, and it's just a floating one, I don't think we have an answer for it, is whether in light of the constitutional amendment, which requires the towns to have their own if they have enough population and everybody to be in a non-floaterial district, and any number of other things, none of which are compatible with the other, whether the 2002 case is actually good law anymore.
Yeah, so I've thought about that a lot. And my thought is that it may still apply because I believe that the one vote, the one person, one vote rule is a federal law, or I don't know if it's a law per se, but it's a federal idea. So yeah, federal requirement. So I don't know if it would actually supersede that or not, but there is a number of different methodologies that would allow for more flexibility in the redistricting process with floaterials that we're actually looking into, that would still satisfy the New Hampshire Supreme Court with their with that 2002 ruling.
Well, and it seems to me that the federal bottom line is a deviation of 10% top to bottom. So if you were within that, you are kind of in a safe harbor. So we argued last time for other calculations, and it was decided not to do it that way, but I just want to bring it up as an issue.
Excellent. Any other questions?
And
All
I want
right.
to
Well,
thank everyone for attending. We will be doing our next Map-a-Thon on September 7th at 6 p.m., where our mapping team will have maps to share with you, and hoping our Map-a-Thon team finalizes the maps, citizen-drawn maps, on September 21st. So we welcome you all to join us on both of those Map-a-Thon dates.
This event has been recorded, and we'll be sending the recording link around to all legislators. And if you have questions for us after the fact, our contact information will be there, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have. So again, thank you for attending. Those of you from the press who would like to stay on, or anyone else who would like to stay on and listen to those questions, you're more than welcome to do so. If you could just mute yourself during that program. Thank you all for being in attendance. We hope that you'll monitor our progress over the next couple of months as we finish our citizen-drawn maps. And we appreciate you coming in and learning about what a fair redistricting process entails. Have a great evening, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. And if anyone wants to unmute and ask a question, we're here. Seeing no other questions.
Yeah, Olivia, I've got one. This is Daryl Perry.
Hi, Daryl.
So I went to the state website that was posted earlier, and I'm not really seeing any info on the meetings as far as when future meetings are happening. Do you have any insight into this? And I see that Representative Cody, I believe, is still in the meeting, as is Representative Griffin. So, Olivia, if you don't know, hopefully one of them can let us know.
Yeah, and I just wanted to tell people that you have to kind of click on the title of this to get the data in the website.
Yeah.
It's a little tricky.
I clicked on meeting schedule, and the only thing listed are previous meetings.
Probably best if you ask Chairman Griffin about that.
And does she want to unmute and answer if any meetings are scheduled or if they'll be just announced when they get scheduled?
Good afternoon. There aren't any meetings scheduled at this point. They'll be announced and put on the website when we've got them.
Thank you. Additional questions? Seeing none, thank you all so much for joining us today, and try to stay cool this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.